Caleb Hart stood alone in the dim glow of his lantern, the old wood of the ranch house creaking against the fists of a restless wind. Dust swept across the plains, clawing at the windows and rattling the shingles like bones in a tin can. His revolver lay across the table, within easy reach, the steel catching the flicker of light. He had long since grown accustomed to nights like these, nights when the storm outside mirrored the storm inside, where memory and silence pressed in until the hours felt endless. But then it came, a pounding at the door. Not timid, not cautious, desperate. A rapid, uneven rhythm that carried more fear than strength. Caleb froze, hand tightening on the revolver's grip. No man knocked like that at this hour. He rose slow, his boots whispering across the floorboards, his eyes narrowing toward the sound. The knocking came again, faster, frantic. Caleb cocked the hammer back, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Who's there?" A woman's voice answered, trembling through the storm. "Please, open, please. Don't let him find me." Caleb hesitated, every instinct screaming caution. He unlatched the door anyway, letting the storm rush in with her. She stumbled inside, clutching a tattered blanket around her head. Her face was pale, cut by shadows, and bruises mottled her skin like cruel fingerprints. Her eyes darted about the room as if every corner hid an executioner. She pressed herself against the door once it shut, her breath ragged, her body trembling from cold and terror. "Don't shave it off," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the words. "Please, he'll kill me if he sees me bald." Caleb lowered his revolver a fraction, confusion twisting in his chest. She tugged the blanket tighter around her hair, as if it were the last defense she had left in the world. He studied her, dust clinging to her dress, blood dried along her collarbone, bare feet scraped raw from running. Not a traveler, not a stranger wandering lost. She was running from something deliberate, something cruel. "Who are you?" Caleb asked, his tone steady but cold. "Anna," she said, her lips trembling. "Anna Vance!" The name hit like a rifle shot in his gut. Elias Vance. Everyone in 3 counties knew him. A cattle baron with a smile that charmed men at the table and a hand that strangled them in the dark. His power stretched like barbed wire across the land. Men followed him, lawmen bowed to him, and whole towns lived under his coin. Caleb set the revolver back on the table but didn't take his hand from it. "Why are you here?" She swallowed hard, eyes wet but fierce. "Because he was going to do it to me tonight. The razor, the shame. He's done it before to others. Says it breaks a woman so she never rises again. I couldn't—" Her voice fractured and she turned away, gripping the blanket. "I couldn't let him take that from me." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had seen plenty of cruelty in his years, but this was its own kind of sickness. He poured a tin cup of water from the jug by the hearth and slid it across the table toward her. "Drink. Then you'll tell me everything." Her hands shook as she lifted the cup, gulping the water as though she hadn't tasted any in days. She set it down with a clatter, eyes shining in the lantern glow. "If Elias knows I came here, he'll burn your house to the ground. He'll do worse than that, please. Don't send me back." Caleb's breath caught in his throat. Images surged. His wife, 5 years gone, her screams lost in the crackle of fire as the house burned. Flames lit by men who never paid for what they did. He forced the memory down, hiding it where it always lived, under layers of dust and regret. He opened his mouth to answer, but then light flared through the cracks in the shutters. Orange and gold, dancing in the storm's haze. Torches. Anna stiffened, every muscle locking in fear. "They're here," she whispered, her teeth clenched so tight the words barely escaped. "His riders. He sent them." Caleb moved to the window, lifting the curtain with 2 fingers. Shapes flickered in the dust, men on horseback, circling like wolves. Shadows loomed, and the glow of their torches cast long claws across the dirt. The crunch of boots sounded outside, slow and deliberate, approaching the porch. Caleb's hand slid back to the revolver, the weight of the steel grounding him as his heart hammered in his chest. Anna clutched his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "If he sees me here, if Elias even thinks I'm under your roof, he won't stop until there's nothing left of you." The footsteps grew louder, the boards groaning under the weight outside. Her voice cold, rough and mocking. "Evening, Hart. Got a runaway in there?" Caleb's eyes flicked from the door to Anna to the revolver in his hand. The storm howled through the cracks, the lanterns sputtered, and the torches outside burned brighter, waiting. He stood frozen, the choice pressing down on him heavier than the revolver in his palm. Surrender her, save his home, or stand against Elias Vance tonight and risk losing everything all over again. The morning broke with a pale light, the storm having dragged itself eastward and left the land quiet but scarred. Dust lay in drifts along the porch, and the air carried the sharp tang of wet earth mixed with ash memories. Caleb Hart stood by the fence, his revolver holstered at his hip, his hands rough and restless against the wood rail. He hadn't slept. The woman lay inside, curled beneath the blanket like a shadow that refused to vanish. He stared at the horizon, and the silence pushed open old doors he had locked years ago. 5 winters back, he had woken to the smell of smoke, the roar of flames, and his wife's voice crying his name. By the time he reached her, the house was an inferno. Men had come for his land, he never knew who, but they left him with nothing but a blackened scar across his forearm and the sound of her screams branded in his memory. That was the night Caleb stopped fighting, the night he promised himself he would never stand in another man's war. Quiet living had been his only prayer since then, but inside his home now sat Anna Vance, trembling, her eyes a storm fiercer than last night's. Her desperation was not his war, yet somehow it had broken through the iron gates of his silence. When he stepped back in, she sat at his table, clutching the blanket around her like armor. Her hair spilled from beneath it, long and dark, a thing she seemed to guard with her very soul. "You don't understand," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from crying. "Bold women here are treated like cattle. No voice, no choice. Once it's gone, you're nothing. Elias makes sure of it." Caleb watched her, the muscles in his jaw working. He poured himself coffee but did not drink it. "And you think I can stop him?" Her eyes rose to meet his, steady despite the tremble in her hands. "No. I think you're the only one who will try." He turned away from her, staring at the dark stain in the wood floor where rain had leaked in overnight. Her words pressed against his ribs like a buried nail. He had run once. When the fire came, he ran into smoke and flames, but too late. He had lived with that failure ever since. The scrape of hooves broke the silence. Caleb moved to the window, his hand falling instinctively to the revolver. A rider was climbing the hill, dust rising behind the horse. He carried no weapon drawn, just a white flag tucked into his saddle. Anna's breath caught. "Elias," the rider slowed, lifted a folded paper high. Caleb stepped onto the porch, squinting against the morning glare. The man was young, sweat soaking his collar, fear hidden poorly behind the mask of duty. He held out the message. Caleb broke the seal with his thumb and read. The words were blunt, scrawled in Elias Vance's hand. "Return my wife by sundown, or your ranch will burn like the last. You've seen what I do to thieves." The paper trembled slightly in his grip, though not from fear. Rage flared where grief had long slept. He looked at the rider, whose eyes flicked nervously toward the horizon. "Tell your master," Caleb said, his voice low. "I've got his message." The rider hesitated, then wheeled his horse and fled down the hill. Caleb stood with the letter crushed in his fist, the weight of ashes heavy in his chest. Inside, Anna whispered his name, waiting for his choice. The sun sat high over the small town, its heat pressing down like a blacksmith's hammer. Dust swirled in the main street, clinging to boots and wagon wheels, hanging heavy in the air. Caleb Hart rode in slow, his hat low against the glare, his jaw tight as stone. He knew this ride carried weight, but the letter in his pocket burned hotter than any sun. Men stopped talking as he passed. Women tugged their children inside. The whole town seemed to fold in on itself, shadows shrinking before the storm everyone knew was coming. Caleb's horse stopped in front of the saloon, and there Elias Vance waited, standing tall on the porch like a judge presiding over a trial he already owned. Elias looked nothing like the cattle barons Caleb had known in his youth. He was slick, polished, his coat black as a raven's wing, his boots polished to a mirror shine. His eyes, pale as winter sky, carried that smug calm of a man who believed nothing and no one could touch him. He smiled as Caleb dismounted, a smile colder than gunmetal. "Caleb Hart," Elias said, his voice smooth as oil sliding across water. "I hear you've been playing host. Dangerous game, sheltering what isn't yours." Caleb stepped forward, hand brushing the letter in his pocket, but never leaving the revolver at his hip. His voice came low, steady. "She came to me for help. That so?" Elias tilted his head, the smirk deepening. "Then help her properly. Return her. She belongs to me." From his breast pocket, Elias drew a folded document, crisp and official. He snapped it open with one hand, letting the pages flutter in the hot breeze. "Marriage contract," he said, his tone mockingly patient. "Signed, sealed, witnessed. Declares Anna Vance my lawful wife. And in clause 4, my servant. The law sees her as mine, body, hair, and soul." He leaned in, letting Caleb see the black ink scrawled across the page. There were signatures, names Caleb recognized from men on the town council, men who bent their knees to Elias for coin. The contract reeked of fraud, but it had enough ink to hang Anna on paper chains. "Return her," Elias hissed, his smile fading. "Tonight. Or you'll watch everything you built turn to ash." Like last time, Caleb's breath caught at the words. Elias's eyes glinted, knowing the scar they touched. He wanted him broken, silent, afraid. The street had gone still. Townsfolk lingered at doors and windows, eyes downcast, none daring to meet Caleb's stare. Fear hung thick, the kind that made men deaf and blind to justice. Caleb turned without a word, boots thudding against the boards as he walked toward his horse. He felt the weight of every silent witness pressing down on his back. Mounting up, he pulled the reins tight, his jaw clenched, ready to ride out. But before he could spur the horse forward, a rough cheer broke out at the far end of the street. Caleb's gaze snapped toward it, and the blood in his veins ran cold. 2 of Elias's men had dragged a woman into the open. She fought, kicking, her hair loose around her shoulders. They pinned her against a post, one holding her wrists tight, the other lifting a pair of shears that caught the noon sun and flashed bright as a blade. The crowd looked away, some biting their lips, some clutching children close, none daring to move. The sound of metal clicking open and shut cut through the silence, like the ticking of a death clock. Caleb's hand closed on the reins until the leather creaked. His horse shifted under him, sensing the tension burning through its rider. His eyes met the woman's for a fraction of a heartbeat, wild, terrified, pleading. The scissors rose higher, sunlight burning on their edge. Caleb knew then, with the weight of the desert pressing down and the echo of old fire in his chest, that Anna's story was no lie. It was happening again, here now, in front of the whole town. The choice was no longer hers, or his. It was written in the dust. The canyon at night was a place of whispers and echoes. The moon hung low, silver light painting the rocks in ghostly shapes, while the coyotes cried far off like mourners in the hills. Caleb Hart led his horse along the narrow trail, Anna walking close behind, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Every few steps she stumbled, her feet raw from days of flight, but she never once asked to stop. Fear kept her moving. Fear, and something harder beneath it. Caleb's plan was simple. Too simple, maybe. Slip her through the canyon, find the freight road west, put her on a wagon train bound for Nevada or further. Out of Elias Vance's reach, out of this land of smoke and ash. He told himself he would ride back alone, keep his ranch, keep the quiet he'd carved from the dust. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was a lie. Anna broke the silence, her voice low, hoarse. "He's not after me for marriage or pride." "Not really." Caleb slowed, glancing back. Her face was drawn, shadows cutting deep under her eyes. "I heard him," she went on. "He thinks I was asleep, but I wasn't. He was meeting men in the barn, the kind who don't show their faces in daylight. Wagons loaded with rifles marked as cattle drives. He's running guns under the army's nose. He said the contracts alone would buy him half the territory." She swallowed hard. "He can't risk me talking. That's why he came at me with the razor. Not just to shame me, because I know too much." Caleb's chest tightened. Smuggling arms meant more than cruelty. It meant power, the kind that corrupted whole counties, that bent law and town alike. He had thought Elias only a tyrant. Now he saw him for something worse. Before he could answer, a twig snapped behind them. Caleb froze, hand sliding to his revolver. From the shadows stepped a man Caleb knew too well, Jonas Pike, his own hired hand. "Evening, boss," Jonas said, his grin twisted by the lantern glow. "Been a long trail, ain't it?" Caleb's gut sank. Jonas's hand hovered near his belt, where a rifle strap gleamed. "Step aside, Jonas," Caleb said, voice like stone. Jonas chuckled, shaking his head. "Wish I could. But Elias pays better. Says he'll double what you gave me for a season if I bring her back tonight. Ain't personal, just business." Anna's breath hitched, and Caleb felt her press closer to his back. "You're selling her out," Caleb growled. "I'm selling survival," Jonas spat. "You think one man can stand against Elias Vance? You'll be dust before sundown." The gun came up fast. Caleb fired faster. The canyon roared with the echo of shots. Jonas stumbled back, blood blooming across his chest, his rifle clattering into the dirt. He dropped to his knees, his grin twisted into a grimace. "You'll burn for this," he wheezed, then fell still against the stones. Anna had dropped flat, hands over her head, breath tearing from her lungs. Caleb pulled her up, his hand steady though his heart thundered. He had killed men before, but this one cut deeper. Jonas had eaten at his table, worked his land, shared his whiskey. Trust had always been a fragile thing. Now it lay shattered in the dust. They moved quickly, Caleb dragging the body into the brush, wiping his revolver clean. But in the scramble, Anna's shawl slipped from her shoulders, falling onto the trail unnoticed. They didn't see it as they hurried into the canyon's shadow, but an hour later, Elias's riders did. Torchlight flickered against the stone, boots crunching gravel. One man held the shawl up, the lantern glow dancing across its frayed edges. "She's still with him," the rider said, his voice sharp with satisfaction. The men turned their horses deeper into the canyon, the hunt alive again. The abandoned mission rose out of the canyon floor like the bones of some long-dead saint. Its adobe walls cracked and leaning, its roof caved in where time and weather had gnawed it hollow. Caleb pushed the heavy wooden doors open with his shoulder, the hinges shrieking like a dying animal. Inside, dust hung thick in the air, stirred by their footsteps, and the altar lay broken in two, a crucifix half buried in rubble. Anna sank against the wall, her body trembling from the long night's ride. Her lips were cracked, her hair tangled, her eyes red-rimmed but unyielding. Caleb set his saddlebag down, counted what little they had, 2 canteens of water, a handful of jerky, and the revolver that never left his side. Supplies enough for maybe a day. No more. She watched him with tired eyes. "You should go," she whispered. "Leave me here. If Elias gets me, at least he won't take your land too." Caleb didn't answer at first. He crouched, striking a match and setting a small flame to life inside a rusted lantern. The light caught the hollows of his face, carved deep with years of solitude and grief. Finally he said, "I can't." Her head lifted, her voice sharp with desperation. "If you fight him, you'll die. That's what he does. He grinds men under his heel until there's nothing left. Don't throw yourself into the fire for me." Caleb's hand paused on the lantern. His eyes drifted toward the shadows of the broken altar, and for a long moment he was not in the mission, but back in his own house. Smoke curling through the rafters, flames roaring against the windows, his wife's scream echoing in his ears. He had run in too late, choking on ash, finding her already gone. He had carried that weight every day since. He spoke low, his voice raw. "When my wife died, I told myself there was nothing I could have done. But truth is, I hesitated. I'd seen the fire building, I'd seen the men circling, and I told myself it wasn't my fight. By the time I moved, it was too late. She burned because I stayed quiet." Anna's lips parted, the fight in her softening as she saw the wound in him, old but bleeding still. He turned to her then, his jaw tight. "I won't run again. Not from Elias, not from this. If I die, then better to die standing than live kneeling." The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of truth. At last, Anna lowered her gaze, her shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from the fragile hope she dared not trust. The night wore on. Coyotes howled beyond the canyon, the sound thin and mournful. Caleb sat by the doorway, revolver resting across his knees, eyes never closing. Anna slept fitfully, her head against the wall, clutching the blanket like a shield. When dawn bled across the sky, painting the mission walls in pale gold, Caleb rose. He stepped to the heavy door, took out his knife, and pressed the blade into the wood. Slowly, with steady strokes, he carved a crude cross deep into the timber, the sound of steel against grain echoing through the hollow chapel. When it was done, he stepped back, eyes hard with resolve. The mark was not for faith, it was a promise. "This ends here," he murmured, voice barely above the wind. "Justice or death." The first rays of sun slid across his face, and in that light, Caleb Hart ceased to be a man in hiding. He had chosen his ground. The ride into town carried a silence heavier than the sky above. The air was sharp with dust, the sun a hard white coin pressing down, and Caleb Hart kept his eyes fixed on the road while his hand never strayed far from the revolver at his side. Behind him, hidden beneath the tarp in the wagon bed, Anna lay curled low, her body tense, her breaths shallow. Every rattle of the wheels seemed to echo with danger. By the time they reached the first row of buildings, the town had already sensed them coming. Men leaned against posts, their eyes watchful but wary. Women drew their children indoors. The street stretched empty before the saloon, its doors swinging open like a mouth ready to swallow. Caleb tied his horse and walked inside, the heat and dust trailing after him. The saloon stank of smoke and cheap whiskey. Men at the tables stopped their games, their laughter drying in their throats as Elias Vance turned his head from the far end. He sat like a king on his throne, his black coat spotless, his silver buttons gleaming. He smiled as Caleb approached, but there was no warmth in it, only the smug amusement of a predator. "Well now," Elias said smoothly, lifting his glass. "If it isn't Caleb Hart, I expected you'd be smarter. Instead, here you are, parading into my hall like a man with cards to play." Caleb didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out the folded contract, and slammed it flat on the table in front of Elias. The crack of paper echoed in the room. Men leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Elias's smirk twitched, but he leaned forward, unhurried, his pale eyes sliding across the ink. Caleb's voice cut through the silence. "That's your marriage contract. Signed with names you forged, witnessed by men you bought, and tucked in its back page your payments. To lawmen, to freight companies. Enough to show you've been running rifles across this land." The room shifted. Boots scraped, chairs creaked. A low murmur ran through the crowd, uneasy as a storm wind. From the doorway, Anna stepped forward, her blanket gone, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her voice, though quiet, carried to every ear. "I heard him in his barn. He spoke of wagons filled with guns, driven under the army's nose. He spoke of blood bought with cattle prices. He said anyone who crossed him would wear shame until they broke." For a moment, silence. Elias studied her, his smile returning, sharp as broken glass. He plucked the paper from the table, held it high between two fingers, then tore it clean down the middle. The sound of ripping was soft, but it cut deep. The pieces fluttered to the floor like dying birds. "No one here will side with you, Hart," Elias said. His voice was almost gentle, but his eyes burned. "These men drink my whiskey, ride my cattle, take my coin. You stand alone." Caleb's hand rested on the revolver, his jaw like stone. "Not alone," he said. "I sent copies. The territorial judge will be here tomorrow, with riders. With law you can't buy." For the first time, Elias's calm cracked. His hand slammed against the table, rattling the glasses. His voice rose, sharp with rage. "Seize her now, before that judge lays eyes on her." The saloon erupted. Chairs toppled, boots pounded, hands lunged for weapons. Anna screamed as men surged toward her, and Caleb's revolver cleared leather with a flash. Gunfire cracked, the sharp stench of powder filling the air. The trap was sprung, and the whole town was caught inside it. The square was thick with dust, the kind that clung to tongues and throats, making each breath taste of earth and ash. The townsfolk gathered in a wide circle, their silence heavier than any sermon. Mothers clutched children close, men folded their arms, but kept their eyes low, as if watching too closely might mark them next. In the center stood Anna, her knees pressed into the packed dirt, her hair tangled from struggle. Her face was pale but unbroken, her eyes fixed on the ground where her shadow lay pinned beneath her. Behind her, Elias Vance stood tall, immaculate in his black coat, his boots spotless despite the dust swirling around him. In his hand gleamed the shears, long and sharp, the metal flashing with each turn of his wrist. He smiled as if conducting a ritual, savoring the fear he painted on every face around him. He lifted the scissors high, snapping them open and shut. The sound rang out like the cocking of a rifle. The sheriff stood at the edge of the crowd, his badge heavy on his chest, his eyes shadowed with shame. He did nothing. None of them did. They had all watched this before. Women shorn of dignity, broken down to silence. The ritual humiliation Elias used to remind them who held the reins. "On your knees," Elias whispered to Anna, though she was already there. His hand caught a lock of her hair, twisting it around his fingers, pulling her head back so the sun struck her face. The scissors pressed close, the steel grazing her ear. The crowd flinched as one, and then came the thunder of hooves. Caleb Hart rode in like a storm given flesh, his horse kicking up clouds of dust that rolled through the square. He sat high in the saddle, his revolver raised, his hat brim low over eyes that burned with fire. His voice cut across the silence, rough and raw. "She's no man's property," the crowd gasped. Elias froze, the shears hovering in midair. For a heartbeat, silence returned, the kind that lives before a gunfight when death has not yet chosen its side. Then the scissors snapped shut, a cruel metallic bite that missed Anna's hair by a breath. Elias turned, his smile gone, his eyes pale with rage. "Kill him," he snarled. The first gunshot cracked, echoing through the square. Caleb's revolver barked, and one of Elias's men dropped, clutching his chest. The dust darkened with blood. Chaos exploded. Men drew rifles, boots stomped, women screamed. The sheriff hesitated, his hand hovering near his holster, his face twisted in a war of fear and duty. Then something shifted. Perhaps it was the sight of Anna still on her knees, refusing to bow her head, or the sound of Caleb shouting over the roar. Or maybe it was the years of shame weighing too heavy at last. The sheriff drew his gun, the badge on his chest catching the light, and fired into Elias's ranks. The crowd roared. One man shouted, "No more!" Another echoed, then another, until the cry rose like thunder rolling through the canyon. Farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, men who had bent under Elias's coin for years, stepped forward. Some carried old rifles, some only fists and fury, but all raised their voices in defiance. The riders who had circled the town now found themselves facing not a lone rancher, but a people awakened. Gunfire sparked like lightning, smoke twisting in the hot air. The judge, a stern man with steel-gray hair, rode into the square with his clerks, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Order," he bellowed. "By authority of the territory, this man is under trial now." Elias spun, fury burning through his mask of control. "You have no right." The judge's hand slammed onto the broken contract, copies spread across his clerk's hands. "Forged signatures, bribes to lawmen, smuggling charges that will hang you higher than any gallows in this land. This contract is void. This trial begins here." The townsfolk fell silent, the weight of law and vengeance pressing down together. Caleb dismounted, stepping forward, revolver still in hand. Eyes locked on Elias. Anna struggled to her feet, hair wild but untouched, her dignity intact. Elias's pale eyes darted from the judge to the crowd to Caleb. For the first time, he saw his kingdom crumbling, the loyalty he thought unshakable turning against him. His hand shook, the shears trembling in his grip. "No," he snarled. "Not like this. Never like this." With a roar, Elias lunged, scissors flashing in the sunlight, aimed straight at Caleb's throat. The scissors flashed as Elias sprang, and Caleb pivoted hard, boots grinding a half circle in the dirt. The blade sliced his sleeve and kissed skin, leaving a bright line across his forearm where an old burn scar lived like a map of regret. He didn't step back. He steadied, breath in. The square seemed to shrink until there was nothing but Elias's pale eyes and the sun burning white behind him. Noise fell away, the shouts, the clatter, the judge barking orders, and there remained only the old ache and the choice that had chased him for 5 long years. Run late or stand now, Elias circled, panting, his black coat torn, dust clinging to the silk like ashes on wet coal. He held the shears in one hand and a straight razor in the other, pulled from inside that fine coat like a snake shedding its skin. "You should have kept quiet," he hissed. "You should have remembered how easily fire spreads." He feinted left, then cut right, razor whistling. Caleb twisted away and felt wind on his throat. Another inch, and the world would have gone dark. The sheriff shouted for the crowd to clear a ring, pushing men back with the barrel of his gun. The judge stood grave and unblinking as his clerk gathered the torn contracts that had already sentenced a kingdom. Anna stood near the well, fists clenched, hair wild and unshorn, her lips moving around a whisper only Caleb could feel. "Don't run!" Elias lunged again. The razor slashed at Caleb's chest. The shears snipped, hungry for hair, for humiliation, for spectacle. Caleb's revolver stayed low, heavy with the promise he had carved on a mission door at dawn. He didn't fire in panic. He didn't flinch from the old fire roaring up his arm, where the burn had awakened like a warning. He waited for the beat between breaths, the one clean tick where a man's rage leaves him naked. "You belong under my boot," Elias spat, circling. "You and the mutinous girl and every coward watching." Caleb's eyes did not leave him. "She's no man's property. This town isn't yours. Everything here is mine." "Not anymore," Elias screamed and rushed him, the razor lifted high. In that split of sunlight the world sharpened. Caleb saw the glint in the steel, the tightness in Elias's jaw, the stamp of a boot about to slip in dust. He raised the Colt and fired once. The report cracked through the square and seemed to travel to the mountains and back. Elias stumbled, eyes wide, surprise breaking across his face like a child's. The razor fell first, winking in the dust. He took 2 awkward steps, as if the earth had tilted beneath him, and then his knees gave way. He crumpled, coat billowing, dust swallowing the fine black like a gulp of water. For a moment he lay there, hands searching for the wound that blossomed dark just below the ribs. He tried to speak. Only a wet sound came out. The scissors slid from his fingers and lay open, harmless at last. Silence expanded, stunned and bright. Then the town exhaled in one shuddering breath. Guns lowered. Men straightened. Somewhere a woman began to cry the way a storm begins, soft at first, then with a relief that cleanses. The sheriff moved forward, boot to boot with Caleb, and nodded once, as if saluting something larger than either of them. The judge lifted his voice, steady as a church bell. He declared Elias Vance a criminal under territorial law. He named the holdings for seizure, ranches, freight wagons, the silent ledger houses that had bled the streets dry. He named the men whose loyalty had been bought and returned them to the common dust, warning that any hand raised in rebellion now would answer to a court that finally had a spine. Elias's riders, though still standing, let their weapons sag. Some slunk away into alleys. Others stood bewildered, freed of a leash they had mistaken for honor. The square changed, as if someone had opened a window in a stale room. Light felt cleaner. The air tasted of metal and dust, but beneath it was something sweet as water drawn from a deep well. People stepped closer to one another. A blacksmith clapped the grocer's shoulder. A farmwife lifted a child so he could see the judge's papers fluttering, symbols of a law that had been a rumor until this hour. Caleb holstered his revolver with hands that trembled only after the danger had passed. He turned to Anna. Her hair fell across her shoulders like new wheat, and dirt streaked her cheeks, and her eyes shone with the stubborn light of someone who had looked beneath the world's mask and refused to bow. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked past the saloon where copies of the contract lay spread like shed skins, the ink accusing, even as the wind tried to smudge it away. They passed the church with its tired bell and the schoolhouse with its shuttered windows. At the edge of town, the land opened to its wide old silence, hills rolling, sky billowing, the road west stretched like a raw stitch on the horizon. Morning had tilted toward noon. Heat rose in ghostly veils from the ground. Anna stopped and turned to him. "Don't let your ghosts keep you," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it held the weight of the night in the canyon, of the mission door scored with a knife, of a square where a blade had stopped one breath short. "You did what you promised," he nodded, unable for a moment to trust his voice. "Keep moving west," he managed. "Find a place where his name means nothing." She smiled, small, real. "I will." She glanced back at the town, at the people standing together for the first time in years. "Make sure it stays this way." "I intend to." He released her hand. She stepped onto the road and went west, shoulders squared, hair catching sunlight. He watched until the heat shimmered, turned her into a wavering figure, and then into the bright line of the day. When he turned back, the judge was speaking with the sheriff about deeds and reckonings. Men were posting notices on doors that had once hidden ledgers. The square had the feeling of a field after a burn. Charred, yes, but ready for green. Caleb walked past the spot where Elias had fallen. The dust had already begun to claim the shape, softening edges, promising, as it always did in this land, to make even loud men quiet. He rode home on a horse that felt lighter beneath him. The plains stretched wide, and the wind came up with the scent of juniper and sun-warmed stone. At his ranch, he swung down and stood in the yard, where 5 winters ago the night had filled with fire and failure. The scars on the door were still there, black lines where heat had licked and memory had stayed. He laid his palm against the wood, feeling the rough grain, the old hurt, the new steadiness gathering at the base of his ribs. In the kitchen, he set his revolver on the table and poured water from the jug. He drank, then poured another, and left it there as if for a guest who might arrive at dusk needing a place to rest. The house was quiet in a way that no longer accused him. Outside, the wind lifted the grass and set the cottonwoods whispering. Somewhere down the road, a wagon rattled with the high, hopeful clatter of beginnings. Night would come, as it always did, and there would be other storms, other men who mistook cruelty for power. But he had stood when the land demanded it. He had kept a promise he had once broken. He walked out to the porch and sat with his hat tilted back, watching the last of the morning burn into afternoon. And for the first time in years, the silence felt like a companion rather than a judge. He could still smell powder if he tried, still hear a woman's whisper riding the wind. He let it pass through him and away, the ghosts unhooking one by one, until all that remained was the ranch, the sky, and a man who intended, from this day on, to protect what the fire could not take.